Hi students. In today's lecture, we're going to look at Daniel Hausman's paper, Affirmative Action, Bad Arguments, and Some Good Ones. To begin, we're going to try and identify what Hausman's thesis is. Worth doing with any paper you're reading. To begin, you want to think about, what's this person trying to argue? Only once you understand exactly what they're trying to argue for, what their position is, are you going to be able to read exactly what they're doing in the right light. So, what is Hausman's thesis? Hausman's thesis is that the most popular arguments for and against preferential treatment in hiring and admission fail. So he thinks the most common arguments we give for and against affirmative action are bad ones. But he thinks that there is an argument in defense of PHA, that is affirmative action, that succeeds. So he's going to be arguing against some arguments, saying that they're bad arguments, and then he's going to eventually give us an argument that he thinks is a good argument that succeeds. So let's start looking at some of those bad arguments. The first one is the racism in reverse argument. This is sort of similar to one of the arguments we looked at last time in the argument analysis section of Schaefer-Landau's intro chapter. According to this argument, it's wrong when hiring or admitting people to college to take into account something other than the applicant's qualifications. Premise 2 of the argument points out that PHA, affirmative action, takes the applicant's race into account. Race is almost always not a qualification. Hausman points out that race may be a qualification in cases where you're trying to cast someone to play Martin Luther King in a movie or something like that. But for the most part, race isn't a qualification for a position. Conclusion, therefore PHA takes into account something other than the applicant's qualifications. I've put this conclusion in sort of a lighter font just to show that Hausman doesn't explicitly put this in his argument, but it is something that follows from premises 2 and 3. And if we combine this conclusion with premise 1, we get the conclusion that PHA is wrong. Now we want to ask, what premise of this argument does Hausman reject? Hausman accepts premises 2 and 3, but Hausman wants to reject premise 1. So that's the argument that's the premise that he's going to try and reject. And he's going to use some objections that we're sort of familiar with. Why I think that it's okay in hiring and admission to take things into account other than someone's qualifications? Well, because we do it in other cases, right? And we don't think that there's anything morally problematic. So Hausman, like Schaefer-Landau, gives the example of military service members. They get preferential treatment on civil service exams or in admissions to college, things like that. They get a leg up. And we think that there's nothing wrong with that. We think that that's fine. Even if someone who served in the military isn't the most qualified person to go to college, even if there's someone who's slightly more qualified than they are, we think it's okay to admit the military, the former military service member on account of the fact that, like, hey, they've done this really valuable thing for a country and we want to give them some benefit. Another example Hausman gives is someone who owns a grocery store and wants to hire their daughter over another applicant who's more qualified. It seems like parents, someone who owns a grocery store, would be permitted to hire their own kids even if someone else applied to a job and was slightly more qualified than their child was. And finally, Hausman gives the example of companies that hire former prisoners, former convicts to serve in their job, in their business. So Dave's Killer Bread, for example, is a company that has former prisoners serving on the staff. And the thought is that this is a good thing, right? It helps people who are getting out of prison to get back on their feet and to be reintegrated into society. Nobody thinks that it's wrong to hire former felons, even if they're like slightly less qualified than other applicants. We can give them preferential treatment if we like. So that argument he thinks against PHA fails. Here's an argument for PHA that he thinks is pretty common. Like, this is sort of what we often think of when we're arguing for PHA, but he thinks this argument doesn't work either. So here's the argument. Premise 1 says those who commit injustices owe their victims damages. Premise 2, massive injustices have been perpetrated against African Americans. Conclusion, those who committed these injustices owe damages to their African American victims. Again, I've got a premise and a conclusion that are a little bit lighter than the other premises and conclusion. And again, that's just because Hausman doesn't say these explicitly, but I think this is what he sort of has in mind. So there's this further premise, premise 3, that what PHA is a way for those who committed injustices to rectify them, and therefore PHA is permissible. So if we look at C1, right, those who committed injustices against African Americans owe them damages. PHA is a way for those people to rectify the injustices, therefore PHA is permissible. To begin, Hausman wants to discuss why we should accept premise 1. And here he has you imagine that your neighbor steals your bicycle. He says, what would justice require? One thing that we can almost all agree on is that Henry should return the bicycle. But do you think he needs to do anything more than that? Do you think he also needs to compensate you for the wear and tear on the bike? Do you think he also needs to compensate you for any other harms that you suffered as a result? When I poll students on these questions, they often say, yeah, Henry should return the bike. And yeah, maybe he should compensate you for the wear and tear on it. But they're resistant to accepting C. So I want to sort of give you some reasons to think that C is right. So imagine that Henry steals your bike, and he doesn't just put it in his garage, right? He bikes around on it and wears down the brakes, wears down the seat. The bike's not in good shape. It needs tuned up. You had just gotten it tuned, but he rides around on it long enough that it's not in great shape anymore. It seems like when you get the bike back from Henry, you deserve to have it in the shape that it was to begin with. And Henry should have to pay for that. You shouldn't have to pay for it all over again. So that's some reason to think that Henry should not only return the bike, but also compensate you for the wear and tear on the bike. And the reason that he should compensate you for the wear and tear on the bike is in a way because he owes it to you to return things to the way that they were before. But if that's true, then it seems like we should accept C as well, that Henry's also got to compensate you for the harms that you suffered as a result. So if I take your phone, let's say, and I hold on to it, and you say, Dr. Spellman, I'm waiting a call, and when that person calls me, if I don't answer it, I'm gonna have to pay $100. And I say, I don't care, I'm keeping your phone no matter what. Well, when you have to pay that $100, you're gonna not only want your phone back, but you're gonna say, and you owe me that $100 that I had to pay, right? So any sort of harms that you suffer as a result of someone sort of stealing something from you, they owe it to you to compensate those. So Hausman says, when rights have been violated, justice requires that, as far as possible, the injustice be rectified, that the world be restored to how it would have been if there had been no injustice. So when I steal your phone, when I give it back, right, I need to not only give your phone back, but if I've broken it, I need to pay to fix it. If I've harmed you in some significant way by making you miss out on a $100 opportunity, it seems like I need to compensate you for that loss that you've missed out on. So that explains why premise 1 is true. We should accept premise 2. The only other premise that's controversial here, right, is premise 3. And Hausman thinks that premise 3 is problematic. So is preferential treatment in hiring admissions a way for people who committed injustices to rectify those injustices? Hausman thinks, no, it's not. Here are some problems. Problem number one, the people who committed injustices against African Americans are long dead, as are the African Americans who suffered the injustices. This is most obviously true with something like slavery. The white people who enslaved African Americans aren't around any longer, right? They don't exist. They died. The African Americans who were enslaved, they're not around any longer. They've died. So affirmative action isn't going to rectify an injustice. And it's definitely not going to be the people who committed the injustice rectifying it. That's one problem. Problem number two with premise three is that rectifying an injustice involves returning the world to the way it would have been had there been no injustice. But there's just no way to do that. We don't know how the world would have been if there had been no slavery, for example. And so it seems like affirmative action isn't a great way, right, of rectifying injustices because we don't know if it's really returning things to the way that they would have been. Would that black student, for example, have gotten into that college if only his ancestors hadn't been enslaved? There's just no way to know that. Number three, even if it were possible to figure out how the world would have been if there had been no slavery, for example, the process of doing so would be too divisive, right? So even if we could find out how the world was, just going about doing it would be so hard, right? It'd instigate fights and maybe cause more problems than it's worth. So for all those reasons, Hausman thinks PHA is not a good way for those who committed injustices to rectify them. Now, what I want to point out is that even if PHA isn't a great way to do it, it's important to note that it's not just because like some time has passed in between. So imagine that your neighbor Henry steals your bike and rides around on it. Decades pass. You both grow old and you have children. One day Henry dies and quote-unquote ownership of the bike passes on to his son. Then you die. One day your son sees Henry's son riding around in what is obviously your old bicycle. What should we do in that case? More specifically, what does Henry's son owe to your son? When I think about a case like this, I think Henry's son owes your son not only the bike, but he also owes you compensation for any harms that you and your son have suffered as a result. And this just sort of follows from the principles we looked at earlier. And it's important to note that this is true even though the person who committed the injustice against me is dead, right? Or you know, however we're sort of conceptualizing this. So the person who committed the injustice is dead. The person who suffered the initial injustice is dead too. But presumably my son maybe is also suffering an injustice, right? Maybe I could have sold that bike. Maybe I could have done all these other things with this bike and given my son a better future if I had had the bike, but I didn't. So my son's worse off. Second, we owe this compensation even though there's no way to know how the world would have been had Henry, if Henry hadn't stolen my bike. So we don't know exactly how the world would have been, but it seems like Henry's son can still do something to approximate it. And this is true even if the process would be divisive. So even if we have to go to court or something and get lawyers and argue about it, it's still true that Henry's son owes my son for the injustices that he's committed against my son. But, you know, of course, what do you think, right? I want to ask, what do you think? Does that sound right to you? Does it not? I would encourage you to think through that kind of case. Now, what Hausman says about this is he says that argument was framed as rectification, like making right an injustice for those particular people. But he says this argument maybe would work better if we thought about this for reparations rather than rectification. And the difference there is kind of subtle, but rectification is like payment to a particular individual for a particular harm. Reparations is sort of a way of saying we're sorry. This is our best way to make it up for you. And so Hausman says, although widely misunderstood, invoking reparations rather than rectification solves the problem of identifying the responsible party. So we don't have to know exactly who owned slaves in order to think that maybe reparations are required. He goes on to say, conceptualizing PHA as the paying of reparations rather than as rectifying individual injustices should in principle avoid some divisive inquiries into exactly which of our ancestors were slave owners and whatnot. But he points out that public discussion tramples on these subtle distinctions, and proponents and critics misunderstand reparations and turn discussions of the issue into acrimonious finger-pointing concerning the intergenerational transmission of personal guilt. So here he's just pointing out that when we start talking about reparations, the dialogue just falls apart. It's a disaster. We're not very good at keeping these sort of subtle distinctions in mind. But finally, and I think this is sort of the important, maybe the sort of the upshot of all this, he says, even if reparations could be ascertained without provoking confused racial animosity, preferential treatment in hiring and admissions is not a defensible way of paying the reparations. In particular, he says that PHA doesn't focus on those who've been the most harmed, and it doesn't distribute the costs of the reparations in a justifiable way. So what happens is that you might think like, well, poor white students are the ones who end up getting harmed by reparations, and they're not the ones who should have to suffer. And so if reparations are owed to African Americans, affirmative action is not the best way to do it. This leads him to the equal opportunity argument, and this is what he takes to be the best argument for PHA. According to the equal opportunity argument, well, let me pause and rewind that for a second. So according to one way of thinking about an equal opportunity argument, we can think of equal opportunity as counting against PHA. So if PHA impedes equal opportunity, then we should not engage in it. It does impede equal opportunity, so we shouldn't engage in it. The thought here is like it's giving racial minorities a benefit that makes the competition unequal. But we could give a very similar argument in favor of PHA, right? This argument actually just says the exact same thing, only replaces the should not with should, and it seems plausible as well. So PHA, so I guess it doesn't just replace the shoulds, but in the first argument we see PHA impedes equal opportunity. In the second argument we see PHA promotes equal opportunity, then we should engage in it. Premise 2, PHA promotes equal opportunity, therefore we should engage in it. So why is it possible that both of these arguments are plausible at the same time? That's a bit of a puzzle. So why does PHA seem to impede equal opportunity and also promote it? To solve this sort of question, Hausman gives an example of an elementary school. So there are 2 first grade classes, 2 second grade classes. One of the first grade teachers is excellent, and one is terrible. One of the second grade teachers is excellent, and the other is terrible. The socioeconomic status of the families in the community is uniform, and the children have had similar preschool experiences. The school board assigns students to first grade teachers by a lottery on the grounds that the fairness policy gives every student an equal chance at a good first grade experience. So we've got a school district that has a good first grade teacher, a bad one, a good second grade teacher, and a bad one. Now, students often complain. They say, well, they should just fire the bad teachers and get better teachers. But that's not always easy to do, right? Depending on how large the area is. Yeah, it'd be nice if they could get excellent teachers, but there are reasons why not every teacher can be excellent. You might think Dr. Spellman isn't excellent. Why shouldn't ONU fire him? I'm the best. I'm the best we've got, right? So let's just sort of set that worry aside. Even though, yeah, it would be better if we could get better teachers. Let's just roll with what we've got. We've got one good teacher and a bad one. We've got at both grade levels. Okay, so now there's a disagreement about how we should assign children to second grade teachers. Some school board members say that every child should have one good teacher and one bad teacher. Other school board members argue for a second lottery. So let's look at how this would sort of play out. So on policy 1, everyone who's has the good teacher in first grade would go to the bad teacher in second grade. And everyone with the bad teacher in first grade would go to the good teacher in second grade. According to policy 2, we have every student who's in the good teacher's class sort of roll a dice, and some of them will go to another good teacher's class, some of them will end up at the bad teacher's class. Same with the people in the bad teacher's class in first grade, right? They're going to roll the dice too. Right? Some of them will end up in the good second grade teacher's class. Some of them will end up in the bad second grade teacher's class. So imagine now that you belong to the school board and you're going to cast the deciding vote to determine how your preschooler's second grade teacher will eventually be chosen, right? So your kid's about to go into school and you need to decide, okay, how am I going to pick what policy do I want to follow? Do I want policy 1, where my child's guaranteed at least one good teacher, or do I want to go with policy 2? Hausman points out that each policy promotes equal opportunity, but they promote it in different ways. So one gives students an equal opportunity of success in second grade, while the other policy gives students an equal opportunity of success in life. So which policy gives students an equal opportunity of success in second grade, right? Policy 1 takes every student who was in a good teacher's class in first grade and forces them into a bad teacher's class in second grade. So students don't have an equal opportunity of success in second grade according to policy 1, but they all have an equal chance of getting a good second grade teacher according to policy 2. So that's the one that gives students an equal opportunity of success in second grade. Everyone has a 50% chance of getting a good teacher. But which policy gives students an equal opportunity of success in life? Well, that's the opposite policy, policy number 1, right? Because in policy number 1, everyone gets at least one good teacher and one bad teacher. In policy 2, you're going to have some people who have 2 good teachers and no bad teachers. You're going to have other students who have 2 bad teachers and no good teachers. So we're going to get a lot of inequality in policy 2. Policy 1, we're going to get much more equality. If we're interested in promoting equal opportunity in general, what should we be more interested in? Giving students an equal opportunity of success in second grade, or an equal opportunity of success in life? And I think when we think about our theories that we've looked at, we can see how Nozick maybe is going to go one direction and Rawls is going to go the other. So Nozick's going to say, as long as everything was fair along the way, policy 2 seems fine, random at both stages. Whereas Rawls is going to say, well, we want to maximize the well-being of the people who are the least well off. And so we don't want it to be the case that anyone has 2 bad teachers. We want to make sure that everyone has at least one good teacher. And so that's going to require going with policy number 1. So to return to the arguments we looked at before, right, the reason that they both sounded plausible, even though they couldn't be consistent, was that there was sort of like a hidden assumption inside of them. So PHA, if PHA impedes equal opportunity of success in admissions or hiring at this particular point, then we should not engage in it. That should be a period. PHA impedes the equal opportunity of success in admission or hiring it impedes equal opportunity at a certain point, right? Who gets into college or who gets hired for a particular job, on equal opportunity there. And so that's a reason to think that we shouldn't engage in it. But at the same time, right, PHA does seem to promote equal opportunity of success in life. And if something promotes the equal opportunity of success in life, it seems like we should engage in it. So this is an argument for engaging in PHA. So at the end of the day, right, the thought is that what we want, I think what Hausman thinks is plausible, is that we want something that promotes equal opportunity in life. It's not important that everyone has an equal chance of getting a good second grade teacher. What's important is that everyone has an equal chance of getting a good education. And in order to do that, we need to give each student a good first grade teacher, or give every student at least one good teacher. And if that means, as a result, we have to give every student one bad teacher, then so be it. Let's say Hausman's argument is compelling. It gives us a good reason to adopt PHA. It will inevitably result in some injustices, right? So even the people who think that affirmative action is good, right? They grant that there are going to be injustices, right? There are going to be poor white students who are harmed by these policies. The thought, however, is that those injustices to the poor white students are going to prevent an even larger number of injustices, right? Why? Well, because by having like these one-off injustices in favor of racial minorities, we're able to support those communities, and that has like intergenerational effects, right? So we stop thinking like, oh, and this is a stereotype, right? I don't endorse this view. Black people can't be lawyers or black people can't be doctors. We sort of have some implicit assumptions there. But if we use PHA, we can get black people into those positions that makes their children, their children's children, see those kinds of careers as careers that are possible for them, careers that they should want and can have. And so it seems like maybe having sort of some individual smaller injustices against poor white individuals is justified in virtue of the fact that we want to help black children be able to see themselves in sort of positions of power within society. But there is this question is like, is that okay, right? Is it okay to sort of perform these injustices against maybe the poor white students, right? In order to achieve this greater social equality. Finally, we can just think about application. And we've already touched on this a little bit. But when we're thinking about affirmative action, right, we want to think back to our theories. What would utilitarianism say about this? Is affirmative action going to maximize utility or maximize happiness? I think that the argument can kind of cut both ways here. It's hard to know exactly what's going to maximize utility. There are reasons to think that affirmative action does, reasons to think it doesn't, right? I'd encourage you to spend some time thinking about how those arguments would go. What about political liberals like Rawls, who think that a distribution of social goods is just if and only if any inequalities are to the benefit of those who are least well off? It seems like Rawls is going to support affirmative action insofar as he thinks that what it does is it helps the people who are the least well off have at least some chance of success in life, and sort of intergenerationally as well. A libertarian like Nozick, though, right, who's more in favor of something like policy 2 in the schools, is going to say like a distribution is just as long as each individual is entitled to the social goods that they have in accordance with the principle of justice in acquisition, justice in transfer, and rectification of injustice. So if we want to have a policy like policy number 2 in our schools, there's nothing wrong with that as long as we're administering it fairly. At the end, right? At the end of the day, what do you think? Whose view are you most sympathetic towards? And are you able to respond to the strong arguments made by the other side? That's the question that we're really interested in. All right, thanks for hanging in there to the end of this lecture. Have a good day.